Hello, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are dialing in from. Welcome back to Sip and Talk.
And to all our loyal Sip and Talkers, grab that coffee, settle in. I'm Sunny, your ever-enthusiastic observer of all things tech and geopolitical drama.
Welcome, welcome. Sunny, before we jump in, I just have to address this ridiculous escalation with my neighbor last week.
Oh, yes. I saw the photographic evidence. You put up a new sign. It reads, "Private domain, do not interfere." This means you, Larry. And you circled it in red Sharpie.
I did.
That is more formal than a treaty negotiation.
That, Sunny, was a formal declaration of my sovereignty.
Oh, okay.
Specifically, my internal sovereignty. I am exercising the absolute right to decide what plants I want to grow in my own yard, who gets in, and, exactly where my garden gnome is positioned.
It sounds exactly like that classic conflict when I insisted on keeping that very loud crypto mining rig on my apartment balcony.
Oh, I remember that.
And the building management sent me all these warnings about noise pollution.
And what did you call that?
I declared it a classic domestic affair, of course.
Right.
That miner was part of my family's investment strategy.
And that's the highest power within a private territory. The neighbor's complaints, or in your case, the condo board's letter, they just become nothing more than ineffective air. Right?
Exactly. The phrase, "it's our family business," is hands down the most invincible human invention. It is the ultimate diplomatic shield.
It is.
The moment you use that line, whether you're talking about finances or, or you're sending the kids to school, everyone else just has to back off.
It's the conversational equivalent of dropping the mic.
But here's the rub, Joe. This is where the simple analogy gets dangerous. What if someone does something truly egregious, something dangerous, in their own backyard?
Okay.
Say your neighbor, Larry, secretly constructs an illegal incinerator back there, and it's spewing this acrid black smoke all over your prize-winning petunias.
Well,
and then he just stands at the property line and declares, "This is purely my internal affair, and no other nation or neighbor can interfere."
Sunny, your absurdity, as usual, perfectly captures the philosophical root of almost every major conflict we face today.
I try.
It's that tension, right?
Yeah.
Between absolute sovereignty and the limits of internal affairs. When we zoom this family business analogy out from your neighbor Larry to, the level of international politics, it morphs into a question loaded with controversy and often the threat of violence. When a major power insists that the fate of a dynamic democracy of 23 million people, like Taiwan, is purely their internal affair, what is the real goal? As critics argue, isn't this strategically designed to find an internationally recognized legal cloak for the future exercise of the power to, and I'm quoting here, sanction, suppress, and even kill?
Absolutely. And that is the mission for our discussion today. We are going to explore what is the true raw nature of sovereignty. Why is it sometimes defined as, the power of a government to use force? And when this ultimate internal affairs card is played, how does a non-state entity like Taiwan, armed with the globally indispensable Silicon Shield, counter this strategic weapon and break through that diplomatic isolation? This is a high-intensity debate, but we promise to be your conversational guides.
Okay, so let's unpack this core concept first. Sovereignty. It sounds so academic, like something you'd only study in a dusty university hall. But it is the foundational legal principle of the entire modern world order.
It's basically the ultimate no trespassing sign for a country, guaranteeing privacy and autonomy.
Precisely. Sovereignty is the idea, central to international law and political science, that a state holds supreme independent power, completely free from external interference. And this isn't some recent innovation. Its modern form traces way back to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648.
Right.
Which ended the devastating 30 Years' War in Europe.
The Westphalian system, that's when all the little kings and princes finally agreed to respect each other's turf, right? They just said, okay, this is your sandbox, that's my sandbox.
Exactly. That treaty emphasized two things. The legal equality between states, regardless of size or strength. And crucially, the principle of non-interference in the domestic affairs of other states.
It established the rules of the international playground.
It really did, where everyone gets their own sandbox and you don't throw sand into your neighbors.
And that sandbox has two essential sides, the dual nature you mentioned earlier.
Right. We talk about internal sovereignty and external sovereignty. Internal sovereignty is, it's the most powerful. It means the government has absolute, unchallenged power over its territory, its people, and its resources.
They are the supreme authority.
The supreme authority, holding all the legislative, executive, and judicial power. Think of it as the government being the ultimate final boss in its own house, deciding everything from tax rates to the criminal code.
So when a country holds a national election or decides to implement some massive infrastructure plan, that's internal sovereignty in action.
Precisely. External sovereignty, on the other hand, is all about how that state interacts with the rest of the world. It's the idea that states are equal subjects in the international community, free to conduct diplomacies, sign treaties, choose their own economic and political systems, all without coercion from the outside.
So theoretically, a tiny island nation has the same legal standing at the UN as a global superpower.
Theoretically, yes.
That makes sense in theory, but here's where we need to get into the really high-impact insights that our audience expects. The polite, diplomatic definition gets pushed aside for a darker, more controversial definition, often linked to classical political thought.
We have to talk about Max Weber, the German sociologist who basically provided a classic foundation for how political scientists define the state.
Okay.
He famously described the state as the institution that holds the monopoly on the legitimate use of physical violence within a specific territory.
That's such a chilling phrase, monopoly on the legitimate use of physical violence.
It sounds clinical, but it stresses that sovereignty is not just about rights. It is the ultimate foundation for maintaining rule. If the state loses that monopoly, it ceases to be a functional sovereign state. It just evolves into anarchy or a civil war.
And this leads directly to what critics call the dark side interpretation. The idea that sovereignty is the power of a government to sanction, suppress, and even kill within its territory, and other nations cannot interfere.
That phrasing, as you pointed out, isn't a formal academic definition, but is a highly accurate, realist description of how absolute sovereignty actually functions globally, especially under authoritarian regimes. It highlights the necessity of state violence to maintain order.
But I have to push back on that a little, Joe. Doesn't the rise of transnational criminal networks, global terrorism, and, massive decentralized cyber warfare prove that the state's monopoly on violence is already kind of broken? Are we still talking about absolute sovereignty when cartels in Mexico or paramilitary groups in Africa effectively control huge swaths of territory and challenge state authority every single day?
That is an excellent point, and it injects the necessary friction into that classic Weberian model. You're right. In the modern era, that monopoly is certainly challenged and, eroded by non-state actors operating across borders. However, international law is fundamentally built on the fiction that the state still holds that ultimate power. When a state can no longer exercise that power, say Somalia in the 90s or fragmented states today, it enters a failed or failing state status, which is the very thing the Westphalian system was designed to prevent.
So the logic behind that terrifying phrasing, the power to sanction, suppress, and kill, it stems directly from the need to prevent the state from failing.
Exactly. If the state is the only entity that can legally use force, then that includes the full spectrum. Enforcing sanctions, punishing citizens who violate laws, suppressing rebellions, squashing uprisings that threaten state stability, and yes, exercising capital punishment or using deadly force to maintain internal order.
So when a government, let's take the example of the protests in Hong Kong in 2019, deploys massive police force to quell civil unrest, from a purely legalistic internal sovereignty standpoint, Beijing is just exercising its enshrined right to maintain order within its territory.
Legally, yes. And the critical phrase, other nations cannot interfere, that's the shield. It's guaranteed by the UN Charter Article 2.7.
Right.
That article explicitly prohibits the UN and member states from intervening in matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. Non-interference is the state's absolute strongest legal defense.
It's the highest legal wall a nation can build.
And let's look at why this defense is so beloved by certain powers. Philosophically, it goes straight back to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, the idea that people willingly submit to an absolute sovereign because the alternative is the miserable short life of this state of nature.
Yeah.
A perpetual war of all against all.
Give up some freedom for total security, a classic trade-off.
In modern geopolitics, this absolute definition is often fiercely championed by powers like China, Russia, and developing nations with, histories of colonization. For them, defending absolute national autonomy is the core principle used to push back against perceived Western human rights interference.
Like the responses we always hear to criticism over Xinjiang or even certain environmental policies, it's always, these are internal matters and we refuse external meddling.
It's a political shield used to maintain control without international scrutiny. Conversely, human rights groups like Amnesty International, they actually cite this same absolute definition to expose power abuse. They highlight how this absolute sovereignty provides a legal umbrella that shields tyranny. Think of regimes in North Korea or Myanmar, allowing them to systematically repress dissidents with minimal fear of decisive international action.
So the same shield that protects a new democracy from invasion also protects a dictatorship from accountability. That is the core tension.
And that tension is leading to cracks in the shield. We have to discuss the major exception, the responsibility to protect, or R2P.
R2P, right. That emerged after the genocides in the 90s. It's the moral argument that if a state utterly fails to protect its own population from mass atrocities like genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, the international community has a responsibility to intervene.
R2P attempts to puncture the sovereignty shield on humanitarian grounds. We saw it applied, or at least invoked, during the 1999 Kosovo War, where NATO intervened without explicit UN Security Council authorization. And that set a very controversial precedent.
But R2P is constantly criticized as selectively applied. Why is that?
Because its application usually requires UN Security Council authorization, and if any of the 5 permanent members like Russia or China feel it infringes on their strategic interests or sets a bad precedent for their own internal disputes, they just veto it.
Of course.
I mean, the deadlock over intervention in the Syrian civil war demonstrates the impotence of R2P when a major power shields an ally. Critics of R2P argue it's often just used by powerful nations as a thinly veiled excuse for military intervention when it suits their geopolitical interests.
Making it a tool of the powerful, not a universal moral law.
That is a fundamental point. It brings us full circle. If a powerful nation can successfully frame a severe dispute as purely an internal affair, international condemnation becomes what our sources called cheap diplomatic noise.
Right.
The only way to counter it is to raise the cost of intervention so high that the great powers must act, even without UN approval.
Right.
Okay, so let's take that conceptual sovereignty shield and watch it deployed in the real world, specifically in the Taiwan Strait. This isn't theoretical philosophy. This is where the definition of internal affairs is actively used as this strategic military and diplomatic weapon.
Beijing uses internal affairs as its ultimate defense mechanism regarding Taiwan. So what is their multi-layered official rationale? Let's break it down.
Their entire claim rests on the core historical assertion. Taiwan is an inseparable part of China, and they build this claim on 3 major pillars. First, the One China principle.
Which is pretty much mandatory for anyone who wants diplomatic relations with the PRC.
Exactly. It mandates recognition that the PRC is the sole legal government of all China, including Taiwan, which they define as a breakaway province.
Yeah.
Second, and this is where the legal history gets messy, they frequently cite UN Resolution 2758 from 1971.
That's the resolution where the PRC took China's seat at the UN away from the RC government in Taipei.
That's what it did.
Yeah.
And Beijing uses this to claim that Taiwan's status is internationally resolved as an internal matter, a leftover from the Chinese Civil War. Now, for the informed listener, this is where the nuance is critical.
Oh, this is so important.
Critics vehemently point out that Resolution 2758 only addressed the representation of China at the UN.
It just decided who sits in the chair in New York. That's it.
Precisely. The text of the resolution deliberately avoids defining the final sovereign status of Taiwan itself. It did not explicitly state that Taiwan is a part of the PRC, which is a key gap. Beijing consistently tries to bridge through sheer diplomatic force and repetition. But for Beijing, citing 2758 is crucial because it provides the facade of international consensus that Taiwan's status is settled.
And the third and most threatening pillar is their domestic legal framework, the 2005 Anti-Secession Law.
That law is the game changer. It legally translates the political claim into a domestic law enforcement mandate. It provides the legal basis for the CCP to use non-peaceful means. That means military action against Taiwan under specific scenarios.
Like if Taiwan formally declares independence or if they think peaceful reunification is impossible?
Right. It's Beijing saying, this isn't war. This is us enforcing our own red-lined, no trespassing sign, Joe.
The anti-secession law is designed to ensure that any future conflict can be framed as a legal mandate to maintain national unity, not an unprovoked invasion.
And they ramped up this legal threat even further recently.
Substantially. The 2024 interpretation of the criminal law added these detailed new guidelines targeting separatists, which means anyone advocating for Taiwan independence with potential life imprisonment or even the death penalty. This is a clear, proactive act of long-distance suppression. They are criminalizing political speech across the strait and basically setting up a list of individuals they could target and arrest if they ever gain control of the island.
So Beijing has meticulously laid the legal groundwork to say, we are just enforcing our own domestic laws against a rebellious province. This brings us directly to the strategic objectives. Why is this framing so critical for them?
3 major strategic objectives are at play here, and they all rely on the success of that internal affairs claim. First, creating the ultimate sovereignty barrier.
Go on.
By defining the issue as purely internal, any foreign military assistance from the U.S., Japan, anyone else, is immediately labeled a severe infringement on Chinese sovereignty.
A violation of the sacred principle of non-interference.
Exactly, which is outlined in the UN Charter. It is designed to raise the legal and political cost of intervention for the West massively.
They force other countries to ask themselves, are we willing to violate international law to defend Taiwan?
That's the question. The second objective is legitimizing the use of force, which our sources dubbed the punishment frame. If Taiwan is officially a rebellious province under PRC law, military action or an economic blockade can be framed by Beijing as domestic law enforcement or simply maintaining national unity.
It tries to sanitize the violence.
It does, and this narrative makes it far harder for the international community to classify military action as an act of aggression under UN standards.
And the third objective is marginalizing the ROC government.
Right. Beijing consistently refuses all state-to-state dialogue with Taiwan's democratically elected government. By reducing them to a local authority or a regional government, they perpetually undermine Taiwan's claim to external sovereignty. They maintain that the only legitimate sovereign negotiation is within the framework of the PRC's authority.
Okay, so now let's look at the dissection from Western analysts. How do they deconstruct this logic?
Critics argue that this entire legal framework, the anti-secession law, the 2024 criminal interpretations, it's purely designed to provide a legal cloak of legitimacy for potential future actions. The goal is to justify everything from military invasion and economic blockade to, targeted arrests of political figures, all under the guise of domestic law enforcement.
It goes back to that terrifying definition from Section 1, the ultimate power to sanction, suppress, and kill. Just dressed up in judicial robes.
A New York Times analysis, for example, highlighted that the primary goal is to reframe an attack on a democratic entity, which would normally trigger massive international outcry, as merely punitive law enforcement against domestic splitters. And this drastically lowers the legal and moral threshold for Beijing to act.
And this framework is specifically engineered to preemptively block R2P, the responsibility to protect principle, isn't it?
Absolutely critical. If military action results in the kind of mass civilian casualties that would usually trigger R2P, Beijing would simply insist that R2P does not apply because this is strictly a sovereign state putting down an internal rebellion.
Wow. This is designed to block the UN or multinational coalitions from intervening on humanitarian grounds, much like we've seen in Syria.
This directly connects to our initial analogy. By claiming Taiwan is its wife, or rebellious child, the CCP asserts the right to manage her as a domestic affair.
And because the PRC holds a veto on the UN Security Council, external criticism from the UN becomes what we termed cheap diplomatic noise. The UN in this scenario becomes a toothless tiger, capable only of condemnation, which lacks any enforcement power against a P5 member. The strategy is to utilize the UN Charter's protection of sovereignty to enable a high-cost action with a low diplomatic penalty.
It's the ultimate exploitation of the international legal system. So we've covered the legal and strategic framing. Now we pivot to the ideological and psychological battleground. Because for the CCP's vision of history, the Republic of China, the ROC, must not just be conquered, it must be considered a historical aberration that is already, extinguished. Why is the ROC's continued existence in Taiwan such an existential, fundamental threat to the CCP's authority? Why is it treated like a ghost in their narrative?
It fundamentally undermines their entire story of historical continuity. The CCP's mandate is based on the idea that they successfully finished the Civil War in 1949 and that the PRC is the sole legitimate successor to Chinese civilization.
Okay.
The continued existence of a democratic ROC government in Taiwan just disrupts this narrative. It suggests the Civil War is unfinished and that the party's claim to represent all Chinese people is incomplete.
And it's not just a historical remnant, it's a living counterexample, isn't it?
That is the deeper cultural threat. The ROC's vibrant multi-party democracy serves as tangible proof that Chinese culture is compatible with Western-style democracy. When Taiwan scores, 93 out of 100 on the Freedom House Index, compared to the PRC's 9, it's a living, breathing challenge to the CCP's assertion that the authoritarian China model is superior and inevitable.
It's the ultimate proof that the CCP's political ideology might be wrong.
And for Xi Jinping, unification is not just a policy goal. It is framed as the final piece of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, consolidating its personal legacy and the party's permanent legitimacy. The ROC flag, therefore, becomes a dangerous symbol of the CCP's unfinished revolution. It must be repressed psychologically before it can be suppressed militarily.
This brings us to that fascinating piece of social psychology we saw highlighted. The reaction of the nationalist young Chinese netizens, the Xiaofen Hong or the Little Pinks. Their reaction to the ROC flag is a simultaneous anger and fear. Our sources perfectly analogize this to a vampire seeing garlic.
The analogy worked because the anger is outward directed at the symbol of unresolved division, fueling their aggressive nationalism. But the deeper hidden component is the fear. The fear stems from the possibility that the ROC's existence could destabilize the CCP's authority, revealing internal cracks in the facade of inevitable unification and eternal stability.
And this fear manifests in these hysterical, almost performative actions. We saw examples from recent years, including reports from 2025.
The incidents of physically covering the flag are so telling. For instance, during a major international exhibition in the UAE in 2025, Chinese attendees were reported trying to obscure or cover the Taiwan booth's ROC flag with the PRC flag or, other materials. These acts are often spontaneous, but they are systematically reinforced by the overarching CCP narrative and its United Front work, which uses non-state actors to project state power abroad.
So the state doesn't have to order it, but the state creates the psychological environment where this behavior is incentivized and rewarded.
Exactly. It's decentralized enforcement of the extinction narrative. We also saw these fascinating anecdotes illustrating the cost of this suppression. The story of the Chinese tourist in Europe in 2025 who was willing to pay a certain amount to literally erase the ROC flag from a piece of art or a sign, but then refused to pay more just to simply cover it.
What does that signify? What's the difference?
It highlights the extreme psychological pressure to achieve total erasure. The willingness to pay money to vanish the symbol shows a deep desperation and wounded national pride. They don't just want to conceal the dissent, they want to affirm that the dissent never existed in the first place.
And when these highly emotional actions are broadcast globally, for instance, on platforms like X, the Little Pinks' aggressive reactions often lead to international mockery.
They do. The tags like #ROCsovereignty trended specifically because people were laughing at the obvious desperation, suggesting that their overly emotional, aggressive attacks are actually backfiring. They're making the CCP's bullying obvious and ineffective.
The counter-challenge from Taiwan users is always the same. Dare you raise the ROC flag in mainland China and shout, "Counterattack!" It immediately highlights the immense internal repression required to maintain the CCP's historical fiction.
The CCP spends massive diplomatic, economic, and information warfare resources globally to promote the idea that the ROC is dead. But every time the ROC flag appears at a major democratic celebration, like the Double 10th National Day Parade or on the international media stage, it becomes an undying lighthouse.
It is a powerful visual counter-demonstration. The sources pointed out that by deliberately displaying the flag alongside other symbols of freedom, like the LGBTQ+ rainbow flag, Taiwan broadcasts an image of resilience and open society globally. This directly exposes the fragility of the CCP's extinction narrative. Taiwan is using its factually independent existence and its vibrant civil society to counter Beijing's legal and ideological weapons. This is where Taiwan shifts the entire geopolitical conversation. They are successfully moving the debate away from Beijing's legalistic internal affairs framework and repositioning themselves as an international security issue, an unavoidable global concern.
And they did this by shifting from being a passive geopolitical pawn, a territory that great powers use to play chess, to an indispensable node in the global economy. This is the strategic pivot to functional lock-in.
And the embodiment of this is the Silicon Shield. This is not an army. It's a corporation acting as a deterrent.
Absolutely. The Silicon Shield is Taiwan's most potent, non-traditional deterrent mechanism, powered by TSMC and other semiconductor giants. The key is concentration. Taiwan holds over 90% of the world's production capacity for the most advanced chips. those 5-nanometer and smaller processors essential for modern technology.
Okay, let's get granular about the logic of deterrence here. Why does 90% translate into deterrence?
The logic is brutal economic self-interest. Any military action by the CCP against Taiwan would not just violate a small island's sovereignty. It would instantly trigger a global economic catastrophe that would dwarf the COVID supply chain crisis.
It would be massive.
We are talking about the immediate collapse of the global 5G network, the halting of AI development, the complete disruption of high-end automotive manufacturing, and crucially, the incapacitation of modern defense industries worldwide.
Can you give me a concrete example?
Sure. Think about advanced military hardware. Modern missile guidance systems, high-speed military communication links, and next-generation stealth fighters all rely on these highly customized, low-volume, high-yield advanced chips made almost exclusively in Taiwan. If TSMC fabs stop, the U.S. Navy, for example, immediately loses the ability to repair or upgrade its most advanced weapon systems.
So the shield is effective because it forces every major democratic power, the U.S., the EU, Japan, to view Taiwan's security through the lens of their own core economic and military interests. They are forced to intervene or at least apply extreme geopolitical leverage out of pure, unavoidable self-interest.
It is the ultimate expression of turning a claimed domestic issue into an undeniable global security problem. This is the power of non-state actors, or NSA, encountering the internal affairs weapon. So let's start with transnational corporations like TSMC. They're acting as strategic non-state actors through their international expansion.
Their expansion isn't just business-driven, it's geopolitical positioning.
Entirely. Their massive investments in the U.S., prompted by the U.S. CHIPS Act, and their key plans for their first European plant in Dresden, Germany, are direct strategic moves. They diversify production, yes, but more importantly, they significantly increase the economic cost of conflict for the CCP by giving allied countries a direct financial and strategic stake in Taiwan's safety.
TSMC is essentially creating economic hostages in allied nations.
That's a great way to put it.
And
they're also engaging in what you called city diplomacy.
Absolutely. Examples like the Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU, between Kaohsiung and Dresden. These are non-state or subnational alliances that bypass the huge diplomatic hurdles of formal state-to-state recognition. They create organic, technical, and cultural international ties that solidify Taiwan's global role regardless of what Beijing claims in the UN.
So the government of Kaohsiung is essentially acting as an external sovereign entity through its economic prowess, circumventing the PRC's isolation attempts.
Exactly. They are weaving an intricate web of global dependency that Beijing cannot simply sever without collapsing key industrial sectors across the world.
Beyond the corporations, we also see NGOs, think tanks, and the media acting as crucial counterpunchers against Beijing's legal framework.
They are on the front lines of countering cognitive warfare. We have to look at groups like the Doublethink Lab, a nonprofit organization in Taiwan. They are constantly monitoring and analyzing China's influence operations during elections.
They expose the methodology.
They do. They analyze sophisticated tactics like the Ben framework: engage, disrupt, narrate, degrade, to show that CCP actions are not internal matters of a distant province, but are a global threat to democratic processes and election integrity everywhere. They provide empirical evidence that Beijing is interfering in the internal affairs of the RRC, a total inversion of the sovereignty claim.
And the think tanks are crucial for the legal and moral reframing.
Top global think tanks like the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, and the Brookings Institution have made a concerted effort to shift the international narrative. They consistently publish reports that define peace in the Taiwan Strait as an international public good.
That's a powerful legal maneuver.
It is. It moves the argument away from who owns Taiwan, which is Beijing's preferred question, too. The world needs the Taiwan Strait to remain peaceful for the global economy, maritime trade, and supply chain stability to function. It provides a moral and economic justification for intervention that bypasses the internal affairs defense.
And international media plays a massive role in combating the ghost narrative.
By focusing constantly on Taiwan's vibrant democratic life, exposing the CCP's internal issues such as the infiltration of organized crime like the Bamboo Union, and broadcasting Taiwan's resilience, they ensure that the world sees Taiwan as a vibrant, separate, functional entity. This makes the rebellious province narrative just impossible to maintain for any reasonable international observer.
This all culminates in Taiwan's strategy of whole-of-society resilience. It's not just the professional military defending the island.
It's a national ecosystem of defense. Taiwan actively involves private companies, universities, and civil groups in defense and surveillance. Our sources noted examples like private citizens and aviation companies monitoring Chinese ships and vessels encroaching on their maritime boundaries. This showcases an undeniable internal will to resist that profoundly challenges Beijing's narrative of a docile, waiting province. This entire network, from chips to journalism, further locks Taiwan into the international security architecture.
We've established that the Silicon Shield model, where an economic non-state entity, TSMC, is Taiwan's superpower, forces other countries to intervene out of pure self-interest. It creates a functional constraint on the aggressor.
This leads us to the final philosophical litmus test. Does this functional lock-in work everywhere? We have to compare Taiwan's economic conflict to a conflict rooted in land and existence, the Israel-Palestine or IP conflict.
The fundamental difference in conflict type is the key to understanding why the shield works in one place and not the other. In Taiwan, the core issue, as it relates to the deterrent, is economic and global supply chain preservation. The goal of the NSA, TSMC, is effectively prevention of war by maximizing cost.
But in the Israel-Palestine context, it's completely different.
The core issues are existence, land, religion, security, and historical survival. Economic leverage is drastically reduced as the primary mechanism for deterrence. NSA action here is less about prevention and more about survival, escalation, or long-term political change.
So the role of non-state actors in the IP conflict is a complex, double-edged sword, completely different from the single high-leverage power of the Silicon Shield.
Absolutely. We see limited positive impacts from NSA. For example, humanitarian organizations, UNRWA, the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders are critical non-state actors.
They act as lifelines for civilian populations.
They prevent utter genocidal catastrophe. Their sustained presence, as highlighted in numerous international reports, provides moral and diplomatic pressure on warring parties. However, and this is the crucial distinction, they cannot stop the war from starting.
Right.
Their function is palliative. It begins after the failure of prevention.
And international activism, like the BDS movement.
The boycott, divestment, sanctions movement is a non-state actor providing a diplomatic challenge. It has successfully framed the narrative among many Western intellectuals and students, applying cultural friction. But its actual economic impact remains limited in terms of changing long-term state behavior. It is pressure, but it's not a constraint. Now let's look at the negative and destructive side. The armed non-state actors. This is where the Silicon Shield analogy utterly breaks down.
Groups like Hamas and Hezbollah are the most powerful and arguably destructive non-state actors in the region.
Their goal is not to preserve the economic status quo or prevent war, but to actively escalate conflict and challenge the state military superiority. They are highly motivated, existentially driven actors who seek to disrupt the sovereign state through force.
And the result of their actions.
They successfully prevent long-term peace implementation. The Economist highlighted that the presence of these armed NSA provides the sovereign state, in this case Israel, with perpetual reasons to continue massive military operations, claiming self-defense against non-state threats. This constantly blurs the line between legitimate state security measures and prolonged occupation or military action.
So the armed NSA in the Middle East functions as a catalyst for the aggressor's continued military action, whereas the economic NSA in Taiwan functions as a constraint against the aggressor's initial military action.
That is the perfect functional conclusion. Taiwan's NSA model offers economic constraint, providing allied nations with an unavoidable reason to intervene out of self-interest. The armed NSA in the IP conflict offers military escalation, providing the sovereign state with an unending pretext to justify using the full extent of its power to suppress and kill.
Joe, I'm thinking back to the beginning, the domestic affairs shield. If China views Taiwan as a domestic affair they want to punish, the Silicon Shield is like the superstar kid they can't hit, because the entire global village relies on that kid's enormous paycheck. In economic-driven conflicts, money prevents war.
And that's the synthesis. The power of non-state actors in the modern era is that they connect national security with global economic well-being, creating a powerful functional constraint on absolute sovereignty. It makes the internal affairs defense obsolete when the stakes are high enough.
But the Israel-Palestine conflict reminds us that when the core driver is not money, but deeply rooted history, land, and survival, this financial leverage it fails. In those cases, non-state power often becomes intensely destructive, polarizing, and serves only to perpetuate the cycle of violence.
The Hobbesian state of nature is never fully eliminated. It's simply delayed or relocated based on the presence or absence of overwhelming economic self-interest.
This has been an absolutely fascinating and deep discussion, moving from the philosophical origins of state power to the cutting edge of geopolitical deterrence.
Absolutely. Let's quickly summarize the core takeaways for you, our listeners, today. First, we established that sovereignty remains the ultimate international defense. But we learned that the CCP's internal affairs shield is a carefully constructed political tool designed to legally justify potential violence and preemptively block humanitarian intervention.
Second, we saw that Taiwan's counter-strategy, the functional lock-in via the Silicon Shield and a robust network of non-state actors like TSMC and NGOs, is the most effective modern defense. They successfully transformed a domestic dispute into an unavoidable global security problem by making themselves economically indispensable.
And finally, the comparison with the Israel-Palestine conflict reminded us that the effectiveness of these modern economic deterrents is entirely dependent on the nature of the conflict itself. Economic shields only work fully when the conflict's core driver isn't rooted in history, land, and existential survival.
As always, we've provided objective facts and analyses drawn from various international perspectives, legal, political, and economic, without taking sides. We just encourage critical thinking in all of you.
Now for our final provocative thought for you to mull over until next time. We've discussed how existing technology, primarily chips, constrains state violence by raising the economic stakes. What happens when new foundational technologies think advanced quantum computing, or maybe bioengineering capabilities, are developed and controlled not by sovereign states, but primarily by increasingly wealthy and sophisticated non-state actors?
Will these new forms of leverage be used to protect populations and strengthen global order? Or will they become weapons that bypass the sovereignty shield entirely, creating new, unpredictable forms of global instability? Something to chew on.
If you want more high-level entertaining breakdowns of world events like this, make sure you subscribe to the Sip&Talk podcast wherever you listen.
And don't forget to check out our old friend Mickey's YouTube channel, Mickeytolife, for funny memes and the latest travel vlogs.
We'll see you next time.